The ghosts of our past have leases on our lives, and the rent is due at 3 in the morning. For me, it was always the sound that came first, not a sound I could hear with my ears, but one that resonated in the hollows of my memory, a dry, clicking static, like 1,000 tiny grasshopper legs rubbing together inside my skull. It was the sound of the world's radio being tuned to a dead channel. That sound always preceded the dream, the one I'd been having for 20 years. In the dream, I'm 22 again. The air is thin, and tastes of pine and impending snow. I'm standing on a shale-covered slope on the flank of Mount Hayes, Alaska. The sky is a brilliant, crystalline blue, but there are no birds. The wind has died. The silence is absolute, a physical pressure, and I'm watching my best friend, Ethan, walk away from me. He's not walking with purpose. He's being drawn, his feet stumbling over the rocks, as if the ground itself is a conveyor belt pulling him towards nothing, towards a spot in the air that seems to shimmer and warp, like heat haze on a winter day. He turns his head, his mouth opens to say my name, Liam, but the sound doesn't come out. It just gets absorbed by the silence. Then he just fades. He doesn't vanish in a flash of light. He de-resolves, his edges blurring, his colors washing out, until he's just a transparent shape against the mountain. Then, nothing. I always woke up with the static still crackling in my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs, the name Ethan a ghost on my own lips. 20 years. 20 years I'd lived with that memory. I was 42 now. The lanky, hopeful young man from the dream was gone, replaced by a history teacher with thinning hair and a mortgage. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon, a world away from the oppressive, jagged wilderness of the Alaska Range. I had built a life on a foundation of routine and order, lesson plans, grading papers, PTA meetings, as if the sheer boring weight of it all could keep the ghost of that mountain at bay. On my mantelpiece, next to a stack of textbooks on the American Revolution, sat a single framed photograph, two smiling, sunburned kids in their early 20s, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, posing in front of a beat-up Ford Bronco. It was taken the morning we set out for the trail. Ethan's grin was wide and infectious, his eyes full of the stupid, brilliant confidence that only youth can grant. My own smile was smaller, more cautious. I was the planner, the worrier. He was the force of nature. He was the one who had convinced me that a 2-week, off-trail trek through one of the most remote parts of North America was a good idea. "It's the last great adventure, Liam," he'd said, "before we get old and boring." He never got the chance. I did. I got old, and I got boring. It was a trade I would have undone in a heartbeat. The search parties found nothing. Not a boot print, not a stray thread from his pack. The official report listed him as missing, presumed deceased, likely the victim of a fall or an animal attack. But I knew what I had seen. I just never told anyone the truth. How could I? Tonight, the dream had been particularly vivid. The static felt louder, the silence in the memory more profound. I padded downstairs at 2 a.m., the floorboards cold under my feet, and made myself a cup of tea. I stood in the dark kitchen, staring out the window at the quiet sleeping street, at the perfectly manicured lawns and the identical mailboxes. This was my reality now. Safe, predictable, haunted. That set when the doorbell rang. The sound was so alien, so out of place in the dead of night, that for a moment I was sure I'd imagined it. It rang again, a sharp, insistent chime. My heart rate kicked up. No one comes calling at 2 in the morning unless it's the police with bad news about a family member. My parents were in Florida, my sister in California. I grabbed the heavy maglite I kept by the door and crept into the foyer. Through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on my porch, a man, silhouetted by the pale glow of the street lamp. He was just standing there, perfectly still. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice tight. "Liam." The voice. It was young, clear, and so familiar, it felt like a key turning in a lock, deep inside my chest, a lock that had been rusted shut For 2 decades. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. It was a trick of my tired, grieving mind. "Who is this?" I asked again, my hand trembling on the doorknob. "It's Sets. Ethan, I think I got turned around." I said, "Sorry it's Sets so late." My world tilted. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. With shaking fingers, I undid the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He stood there, bathed in the cold white light of my porch lamp, and it was him. It was Ethan, not an older Ethan, not a weathered, traumatized version of him. It was him exactly as he was in the photograph on my mantelpiece, 22 years old, his dark hair messy, his face lean and unshaven. He was wearing the same faded green fleece, the same cargo pants, the same scuffed-up hiking boots. He even had his old, battered pack slung over one shoulder. There wasn't a single new line on his face. He hadn't aged a day. "Ethan," I whispered, the name feeling foreign and sacred. "Hey man," he said, and he smiled. It was the same easy grin from the photo, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were calm, clear, and completely, utterly empty. There was no confusion in them, no fear, no relief, nothing. They were like beautiful, polished stones. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. A flood of emotions, shock, joy, terror, disbelief, crashed over me, leaving me speechless. Tears streamed down my face. I stumbled forward and threw my arms around him. It was like hugging a statue. He was solid, real, but there was no response, no warmth. He just stood there patiently in my embrace. I pulled back, my hands on his shoulders. His fleece felt dry and cool, not damp from the night air. "My God, Ethan, where have you been? I thought you were dead." "I said not dead," he said, his tone simple, factual. "I was on the trail, the one near the glacier. I must have taken a wrong turn. It got dark. I just found the road a little while ago and saw the lights from your house." I stared at him, my brain short-circuiting. The trail, the glacier, that was in Alaska. We were in Oregon, and it had been 20 years. "Ethan, what year do you think it is?" I asked, my voice trembling. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity. "It's Sets. 2005, September, right? We were supposed to be back by the 15th. My blood ran cold. I pulled him inside, my hand wrapped around his arm. His skin was cool to the touch, not cold like it should have been, just neutral, room temperature. He stepped into my house, his hiking boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. He looked around my living room, at the large flat-screen TV, the sleek laptop on the coffee table, the modern furniture, with the same detached curiosity he'd shown everything else. There was no shock, no wonder. It was as if he were a tourist looking at exhibits in a museum of a slightly different culture. You should sit down," I stammered, leading him to the couch. "Are you hungry? Are you hurt?" "No," he said, sitting with a strange, precise economy of motion. "I am not hungry. I am not injured." I just stared at him, my mind a vortex of impossible questions. Amnesia? A fugue state? Had he been living wild for 20 years, completely disconnected from society? But that didn't explain why he hadn't aged, or why he was wearing the exact same clothes, or how he had traveled over 2,000 miles from a remote Alaskan mountain to my specific front door. My old dog, Buster, a sleepy golden retriever, padded into the room, alerted by the voices. He took one look at Ethan, and the fur on his back went rigid. A low guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a puppy. He backed away slowly, whimpering, and hid behind my legs. Ethan watched the dog with his placid, empty eyes. "The animal is distressed," he observed, his voice a flat, analytical statement. I knelt and calmed Buster, my hand stroking his trembling back. When I looked back up, Ethan was staring at the television, which I'd left on a muted news channel. He wasn't watching the news. He was staring at the faint shimmering static in the dark parts of the screen. His focus was absolute, his stillness unnerving. The joy of his return was rapidly being consumed by a thick, creeping dread. This person looked like Ethan. He sounded, mostly, like Ethan. But the man I knew, the vibrant, reckless, loud, emotional force of nature, who had been my best friend, was not sitting on my couch. This was a replica, a perfect hollow copy. I finally managed to convince him to go upstairs to the guest room. He followed without question, his steps silent. I gave him a change of clothes. My clothes, which were far too large for his 22-year-old frame, but he just placed them neatly on the bed, preferring to stay in his hiking gear. "Get some rest," I said, standing in the doorway, the words feeling utterly inadequate. We settle, figure this out in the morning." "Okay, Liam," he said, turning to face me. "I will rest now." I closed the door, my hand shaking so hard I could barely grip the knob. I leaned against the cool wood, my heart pounding a sick, frantic rhythm. I had spent 2 decades praying for a miracle, for Ethan to come home. Now he was here, sleeping, or whatever he did, in my guest room, and I had never been more terrified in my life. I felt a profound, bone-deep chill, the kind you feel when you realize you've made a terrible mistake. I hadn't just opened my door to my long-lost friend. I had opened it to the mountain, to the silence, to the static. I had let the ghost in. I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair in my living room until the first watery gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, my gaze fixed on the guest room door. Every creak of the house settling was in my mind, the sound of Ethan moving, of the alien presence in my home stirring. I think a part of me, the rational, 42-year-old history teacher part, desperately wanted it all to be a dream. I hoped I would blink and find myself waking up from the nightmare, the guest room empty, the silence of my house blessedly normal again. When the sun was fully up, I forced myself to move. I went upstairs and pushed open the guest room door. The bed was untouched. The change of clothes I'd given him was still folded neatly on the pillow. Ethan wasn't there. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought he'd gone, that the phantom had vanished with the night. Then I heard a sound from downstairs, a soft, rhythmic clicking. I found him in my study. He was standing motionless in front of an old framed map of the 13 colonies, his back to me. The clicking sound was coming from him. He was tapping his fingernail against his front tooth, a nervous habit he'd had since we were kids. It was such a human, familiar gesture that a wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw what he was staring at. Not the map itself, but the intricate spidery patterns of the aged paper, the faint water stains like ghostly continents. His focus was absolute. "Ethan," I said softly. He stopped tapping but didn't turn. "The patterns are complex," he said, his voice as flat as it had been the night before. "The decay follows a predictable, yet chaotic model, like a coastline." "It sets just an old map," I said, my unease returning. "Come on, let's get some breakfast. I said'll make you whatever you want." "Pancakes. You always loved my pancakes." I tried to inject a sense of normalcy into the morning, a desperate attempt to overlay the familiar past onto this terrifying present. I bustled around the kitchen, pulling out flour and eggs, making the kitchen noisy and warm. Ethan sat at the table, his posture unnaturally perfect, his hands resting on his knees. He watched my every move, not with the anticipation of a hungry man, but with the focused attention of a scientist observing an experiment. I placed a plate of steaming pancakes in front of him. "Syrup's on the table," I said, my voice straining to sound cheerful. He looked at the plate. He picked up his fork, his movements precise and deliberate, like a robot learning a new task. He cut a perfect square from the stack, lifted it, and held it in front of his face, examining it. He didn't eat it. He just looked at it for a full minute before placing it carefully back on the plate. The composition has changed, he stated. Heat has altered its molecular structure. That's called cooking, Ethan. The words came out sharper than I intended. He didn't respond. He just continued to stare at the plate. I ate my own breakfast in a tense silence. The sound of my chewing unnaturally loud. I had to know more. I had to break through this wall of detached observation. Can you tell me anything else about what happened? I pressed gently. After we got separated, you said you just found the road. Was that today? Yesterday? He looked up from the pancakes, his empty eyes meeting mine. There is no thee after Sita, he said. There was the trail. The rocks were sharp. The air was thin. You said we should have brought more water. Then there was the road. The time in between is an unspooled thread. Data is missing. Data is missing. He spoke about his life like a corrupted file on a hard drive. Before I could ask another question, a cardinal landed on the bird feeder outside the kitchen window and let out a loud, complicated, beautiful song. Cheer, cheer, cheer. Purty, purty, purty. Ethan's head tilted. A moment later, his mouth opened, and he reproduced the sound. It wasn't a whistle, it wasn't an imitation, it was a perfect pitch-for-pitch, flawless audio replica of the cardinal's call. It was so exact that Buster, who had been sleeping in the corner, lifted his head and barked at the window, thinking the bird was in the room. I stared at Ethan, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. How did you do that? He showed no sign of pride or even awareness that he'd done something extraordinary. The acoustic information was available, he said simply, as if explaining why the sky was blue. Just then, the microwave beeped, signaling my tea was ready. It was a specific 3-note chime. A second later, Ethan mimicked it perfectly. Beep boop bip. It was uncanny, terrifying. He was a human recorder, a perfect mimic, but the recordings had no soul behind them. I needed to see him in the sun. I needed to see him in the real world, away from the strange, recycled air of my house. Let sets go out back, I said, standing up abruptly. Get some fresh air. He followed without protest. The backyard was bright, the morning sun casting long, sharp shadows across the green grass. I watched him as he stood in the center of the lawn, his head tilted up towards the sky. He looked solid, real, a young man basking in the sun. My hope flared again. Maybe I was overthinking this. Maybe it was all just a strange, explicable trauma response. Then I looked down at his feet, and the hope died. His shadow was wrong. It was faint, indistinct. My own shadow on the grass was a sharp, dark shape, clearly defined. His was a pale, fuzzy smudge, like a watercolor painting that had been left out in the rain. It was as if the sunlight was passing partially through him, as if he wasn't fully present in our physical world. He was a projection, slightly out of focus. I felt a wave of dizziness and stumbled back against the patio door, my breath catching in my throat. This was not trauma. This was not amnesia. This was a violation of the laws of nature, happening right there on my perfectly manicured lawn. I left him in the yard, still staring at the sun, and retreated to my study, closing the door. I needed facts. I needed data of my own. I sat at my computer and typed Mount Hayes' strange phenomena into the search bar. 20 years ago, the internet was a different beast. Information was sparse. Now it was a torrent. I found them within minutes. Forums for hikers and climbers, blogs from amateur geologists, conspiratorial threads on fringe websites. They all talked about the Hayes Range. They called it the Silent Sisters. I found at least 4 other documented cases of solo hikers vanishing without a trace in the same specific quadrant where Ethan and I had been. I found dozens of accounts of strange experiences, sudden profound silences where all ambient sound would just cease, compasses spinning uselessly, hikers reporting hours of missing time, finding themselves miles from where they thought they were with no memory of the journey. Then I found it. a declassified US Geological Survey report from the 1980s. It described a massive, deep-seated magnetic anomaly in the region, a null zone, where the Earth's magnetic field was inexplicably and almost completely absent. The report called it a geological curiosity, but reading it now, my skin crawled. The silence, the compass, the disappearances. They were all connected. This wasn't just a place, it was a wound in the world's magnetic skin. A sharp bark from the living room jolted me from my research. I ran out to find Buster growling, his teeth bared at the base of the stairs. Ethan was coming down, and the gentle old dog was reacting as if a wolf had just walked into the house. "Buster, no, heel," I commanded, grabbing his collar. Ethan stopped on the bottom step and looked at the dog. He knelt down slowly and extended a hand. "Its threat response is elevated," he noted calmly. "He's not an it, Ethan. He's a dog," I said through gritted teeth. As Ethan's hand got closer, Buster lunged, snapping at the air just inches from his fingers. I yanked him back, shocked. Buster had never so much as snarled at a person in his life. Ethan retracted his hand, his expression unchanged. He showed no fear, no surprise. The biological imperative for self-preservation is strong in this organism. I dragged Buster into the kitchen and closed the door, my heart pounding. I was losing control. The sheer cumulative weight of all the wrong details was crushing me. I walked back into the living room, determined to get a straight answer. "Ethan, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I was just reading about the mountain, about a magnetic anomaly. Something happened to you up there, something more than just getting lost." He looked at me, his head tilted. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a ghost of the old Ethan, but then it was gone. "The rocks were sharp," he said, his voice a distant echo. "The air was thin. You said we should have brought more water." He wasn't answering my question. He was accessing a file, a memory, from our last day together. He was quoting me. A cold dread washed over me. It wasn't a conversation. I was interacting with a recording. I backed away, stumbling into the hall. I felt trapped, cornered in my own home. I was alone with this thing, this perfect copy of my friend that was not my friend. Going to the police was impossible. "Officer, my friend, who vanished 20 years ago, is back. He hasn't aged, and his shadow is too faint." They would put me in a padded room. I retreated to my study and locked the door. I could hear him in the living room. He had started making noises again. He was mimicking the sound of the ice cream truck that had just passed down the street, its cheerful, tinkling melody now sounding like a funeral dirge in the quiet of my home. The sound was a perfect replica, but it was hollow, empty, a recording with nothing behind it. Just like the man who was making it. The next 24 hours were a slow, creeping hell. I confined myself mostly to my study, pretending to work on lesson plans, but in reality, I was watching him. I'd leave the door cracked, just an inch, my eye pressed to the sliver of space, observing the alien entity that wore my best friend's face. My home had become a laboratory, and Ethan was the specimen, a specimen that was free to roam. He did not behave like a person. He didn't read, watch television, or listen to music. He didn't sleep. He moved through the rooms of my house with a quiet, unnerving purpose, cataloging his environment. I watched him stand for nearly an hour, motionless, tracing the complex patterns of the Persian rug in the hallway with his eyes. I saw him pick up a glass from the counter, holding it up to the light, not to drink from it, but to observe the way the light refracted through it. His existence was a series of passive observations, punctuated by the startlingly perfect mimicry of ambient sounds, the drone of a passing airplane, the frantic beep of a reversing garbage truck, the chime of a text message arriving on my phone. He was a ghost in the machine of my life, a program running on a loop of quiet, unnerving subroutines. The psychological pressure was immense. The silence in the house was heavier than any sound. I felt a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety, a feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by a camera. I was an exhibit in the museum of my own life, and he was the sole silent visitor. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The not knowing was hollowing me out. I had to try something. I had to break through the placid, empty surface and see what, if anything, was left of the man I knew. I needed to force the memory, to trigger a system crash, a reboot, anything that wasn't this placid, horrifying null state. My eyes fell on the photograph, on the mantelpiece, the one of us on that final morning. It was the last moment that the real Ethan had existed, full of life and stupid, beautiful confidence. That photo was the source code. It was the only key I had. My heart pounding, I took the frame from the mantel, slipped the photo out from behind the glass, and walked into the living room. Ethan was standing by the window, staring at a spiderweb in the corner, with that familiar, intense focus. "Ethan," I said, my voice hovering in the silent air. He turned slowly, his movements fluid and precise. His blank eyes settled on me. "I want to show you something," I said, my hand trembling as I held out the worn, glossy photograph. "Look, this was us, the morning we left for the hike. Do you remember this? Do you remember how excited you were? You said it was our last great adventure." He took the photograph from my hand. His cool, dry fingers brushed against mine, and I flinched. He looked down at the image of the two smiling young men, his head tilting in that curious, analytical way. He held it for a long, silent moment. I held my breath, praying for a spark, a flicker of recognition, of emotion. At first, there was nothing, just the same placid observation. But then, something changed. His eyes, which had been focused on the photo, seemed to lose their focus, gazing at a point somewhere beyond it. His body went rigid. A low hum started in his chest, and then the sound from my dream, began to emanate from his throat. A dry, electric, clicking static. It wasn't a mimicry. He was broadcasting it. The lights in the living room began to flicker in time with the clicks, casting the room in a strobing, nightmarish pulse. The air grew cold and thin, and the world around me dissolved. I was no longer in my living room. I was standing on a shale-covered slope on the flank of Mount Hayes, Alaska. The memory wasn't hazy or dreamlike. It was hyper-real, more vivid than my own recollection. It was raw data being played back directly into my consciousness. The air was thin and tasted of pine and impending snow. The sky was a brilliant crystalline blue, and the silence, it was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. I saw my own younger self standing a few feet away, his face etched with confusion, looking around for the source of the sudden quiet. I saw Ethan, 22, and vibrant, take a few steps forward, a nervous grin on his face. "Whoa," he said, but the word was a puff of air, swallowed by the silence. My younger self pulled out his compass. I watched him stare at it, his face paling. From this new perspective, I could see what he saw. The needle wasn't just spinning, it was vibrating with furious, impossible speed. A silver blur oscillating between magnetic north and a point in the air directly in front of Ethan. The landscape itself began to feel wrong. I could perceive the subtle shifts my younger self had only felt. The trees at the edge of my vision would move when my attention was elsewhere, their positions subtly different each time I glanced back. The perspective of the mountain ahead seemed to stretch and compress, like a lens trying and failing to find focus. The world was a rendering error. And then we saw it. The thing we had stumbled upon, the source of the null zone. It wasn't a ship or a creature. It was a hole in the world. A patch of air, perhaps 50 feet across, that shimmered and buckled. It was like watching reality through a warped, antique pane of glass. The image of the mountainside behind it was distorted, bent into impossible, fluid shapes. It gave off no light, yet it was impossible to look away from. It was a wound. From the shimmering distortion came the sound, the true sound, not the echo in my dreams, but the source itself, an overwhelming torrent of dry, clicking static, interwoven with millions of overlapping whispers. It was the sound of a billion crosstalk radio signals, the sound of every thought ever thought, a cacophony of pure raw information. I watched in horror as Ethan took a step towards it, his face a mask of awe and terror. "Liam," he whispered. And this time I heard the sound clearly in the memory. "I can see it. It sets not a thing. It sets the code, the source code. It sets so beautiful." "Ethan, get back," my younger self screamed, the sound deadened by the oppressive silence. He lunged forward to grab Ethan's arm, but his hand passed right through it. Ethan's arm dissolved into a mist of glowing particles at my touch, then reformed as I pulled my hand back. He was no longer entirely physical. He was an image on a screen, and the anomaly was the magnet. He took another step, and another, drawn into the shimmering rift. He walked directly into the distortion, and I watched, helpless, as it unmade him. His body began to de-resolve, his edges blurred, his clothes and skin fading into transparency. He was being disassembled, molecule by molecule, his physical data being scanned and absorbed. He turned his head one last time, his eyes meeting mine. The placid curiosity was gone, replaced for a single horrifying instant by a look of pure undiluted understanding. He saw what the entities were. He saw what was happening to him, and then he was gone. The distortion shimmered one last time, collapsed in on itself with a final silent implosion, and vanished. Sound rushed back into the world. The wind howled. The birds began to sing again. My younger self was left alone on the mountain, screaming his friend's name into the indifferent, silent sky. The world snapped back. I was on my knees in my living room, gasping, sweat beading on my forehead. The photo lay face down on the rug. The lights were steady. The air was normal. The clicking was gone. Ethan stood over me, his head tilted. The blank, placid look was back, as if nothing had happened. He looked down at me, a dispassionate observer, noting the results of his experiment. "The archive is intact," he said, his voice perfectly flat, playback complete. He hadn't been remembering. He hadn't been reliving. He had been playing a file, and my most private searing trauma, my own memory of that day, had been nothing more than a part of the recording. The entities hadn't just taken him, they had taken a snapshot of everything, and he was the projector. Downstairs, the house was silent. It was a new kind of silence, deeper and more unnerving than before. It was the silence of observation. I knew with a certainty that made my skin crawl that Ethan wasn't just waiting, he was monitoring. I was a bug under his microscope, and the house was my petri dish. The feeling was so intense, so pervasive, that I found myself moving with unnatural quiet, holding my breath, as if I could somehow hide from the silent, omniscient gaze of the thing in my guest room. The playback ended, but the echo remained. I spent the next few hours locked in my bedroom, my back pressed against the door, as if that could keep the creeping wrongness at bay. My living room, the site of the forced memory, felt contaminated, a psychic crime scene. I could still feel the phantom thinness of the Alaskan air in my lungs, still see the shimmering hole in reality behind my closed eyelids. The experience had been more than a memory, it had been a download. Ethan hadn't just shown me what happened, he had made me live it again, but with the terrifying clarity of the entity's recording, he had overwritten my own flawed human trauma with his perfect cold data. Eventually, a raging thirst drove me from my sanctuary. My throat was parchment dry, my head pounding from the ordeal. I crept down the stairs, every sense on high alert. Ethan was in the living room, standing by the large bay window that overlooked the street. He was perfectly still, watching the mundane pageant of suburban life. A mail truck making its rounds, A woman jogging with a stroller, with the same rapt attention he'd given the patterns on my rug. I skirted around him, giving him a wide berth, and entered the kitchen. The air was thick and foul. A gag reflex rose in my throat. It was the smell of accelerated decay, a sweet, sickly stench of rot that seemed impossible in my clean, sterile kitchen. I pulled open the refrigerator door, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. Everything inside was ruined. A carton of milk I had bought yesterday was bloated and curdled, a fuzzy green mold crawling up its sides. A head of lettuce had turned to a black, slimy mush. The leftover chicken casserole from 2 nights ago was now a landscape of strange, crystalline fungi, glittering faintly in the fridge's light. It was as if weeks of decomposition had been compressed into a few hours. Ethan's presence, the localized rift in reality he carried within him, was actively unraveling the laws of my world. Time itself was becoming unstable around him. I slammed the door shut, my stomach churning, and stumbled back. I caught my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. For a horrifying instant, the face staring back was not my own. It was the face of my 22-year-old self from the mountain, his expression a mask of sheer terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. I yelled and jerked away, my heart hammering. When I dared to look again, my own tired 42-year-old face stared back, pale and slick with sweat. I fled to the bathroom upstairs, splashing cold water on my face. I gripped the edges of the sink, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look in the mirror again. My reflection was normal, thank God, but the background wasn't. For a split second, the familiar tiled wall behind me was gone, replaced by a breathtaking, terrifying vista of the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Alaska Range under a cold, indifferent sky. I could almost feel the wind on my face. I blinked, and my bathroom was back. The two places, my safe suburban home and that haunted Alaskan mountain, were bleeding into one another. The border was collapsing. I was no longer sure what was real and what was a memory playback. I began to smell it then. A faint, clean scent of pine needles and cold stone right here in my house. I heard the whisper of a high-altitude wind that wasn't there. Was it real? Or was the playback permanently scarring my senses, leaving phantom limbs of memory I would never be free of? It was a glitch, a momentary superimposition of the archived data onto the present. My own reflection was no longer reliable. Then he spoke in his own flat voice, but the words were not his. The true turning point, the moment my fear solidified into a new kind of existential dread, came that evening. I was in my study, the door locked, trying to ground myself in the familiar weight of history textbooks. I could hear Ethan downstairs. He was mimicking again, but it was different now, more complex. I heard him perfectly replicate the voice of a news anchor from a program I'd been watching earlier. Then I heard him whisper a few lines of a song that had been playing softly on the radio. "You thought, Fed, we are going to die here, Sat." I froze, the book slipping from my fingers. It was a direct quote, not of something I had said on the mountain, but something I had thought. It was the raw, panicked internal monologue that had been racing through my mind as I watched Ethan walk towards the anomaly. A thought I had never spoken aloud, never shared with a soul. The house felt like it was shrinking around me. I looked out the window, desperate for a glimpse of the normal world, of objective reality. I saw my next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a cheerful retiree, out on his lawn, meticulously watering his rose bushes. I watched him, grateful for the mundane sight. He bent down, adjusted the nozzle on his hose, and stood back up. Then he did it again, bent down, adjusted the nozzle, stood back up, and again, a perfect 3-second loop, executed with the jerky, unnatural precision of a corrupted animation. After the third repetition, he froze for a half-second before resuming his gardening, as if nothing had happened, a placid smile on his face. The entities hadn't just recorded sight and sound, they had recorded everything. Every stray thought, every synaptic firing. They had copied my consciousness. I couldn't take it anymore. I unlocked my study door and stormed downstairs. I had to confront him. I had to know what he was. The glitch was spreading. The field of distortion around Ethan was expanding beyond the walls of my home, starting to subtly edit the world and the people around him. He was standing in the very center of the living room, a point equidistant from all four walls, as if he'd calculated the room's exact center of mass. He turned to face me as I approached. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice raw. "Why did you come back? What are you?" "The archive is still compiling," he said, his voice the placid, toneless hum of a machine stating its function. "More data is required for a complete profile. The sample size was insufficient." He looked at me. His head turned and kept turning, a little too far to be natural, his neck emitting a faint, dry clicking sound like a camera lens focusing. A smile spread across his face. It was Ethan's smile, the exact joyful lopsided grin from the photograph, but on his face, it was a terrifying mask, a rictus of imitated humanity. I wasn't the survivor, I was just the sequel. The blood drained from my face. I finally understood. His return wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the next chapter. The entities weren't done. They had sent their probe back to the source of the other half of the data from that day on the mountain, back to me. The words hung in the air between us, colder and sharper than any Alaskan wind. More data is required. I was no longer a person. I was a data point, the missing half of a 2-decade-old experiment. The fear I had been feeling for the past 2 days was a pale, flimsy thing compared to the absolute, soul-crushing certainty that washed over me now. You can't reason with a data collector. You can't plead with a program. You can only wait for it to execute. "No," I whispered, the word barely audible. I began to back away, my hands held up as if to ward off a physical blow. "No, you said not taking me. I said not going with you." Ethan's set smile remained fixed. "A terrifying digital artifact. Your cooperation is not a required parameter," he said, his voice calm. "The process has already begun. The local environment is being conditioned." He was right. The house was no longer my own. The subtle wrongness had escalated into a full-blown system failure. The scent of pine and cold stone was now so strong it was like standing in the middle of a forest. The floorboards beneath my feet felt uneven, like the shale-covered ground of the mountain slope. A fine, impossible layer of frost was creeping across the living room windows, etching them with the same non-Euclidean, fractal patterns I had seen in the memory playback. I turned and ran, not to hide, but to fight. My only weapon was the truth, the physical evidence of the last 20 years of my life. I scrambled into my study, my sanctuary that was now just another corrupted file, and began pulling things from the shelves. I grabbed my high school yearbooks, my college diploma, framed photos of my parents, of my sister at her wedding. I grabbed a stack of graded history papers, the red ink of my corrections, a stark human slash against the typed text. I dumped them all on the floor in front of him, creating a messy, chaotic barricade of a life lived. "Look at this," I yelled, my voice cracking. "This is me. This is my life. It's not data. It's real." I got old, Ethan. I got boring, just like we were afraid of. I have a mortgage, and a bad back, and students who think the Cold War was a weather event. You can't have it. He looked down at the pile of my life's ephemera with detached curiosity. He bent down and picked up a photograph of me standing with my sister, both of us laughing at some long-forgotten joke. "This emotional response," he said, tapping the photo, "is a recursive loop triggered by specific chemical and electrical stimuli. It can be replicated." He was dissecting my joy, reducing it to an algorithm. He wasn't just going to take my memories, he was going to strip mine them for their emotional content, leaving behind nothing but the hollowed-out data. The world outside the bay window began to glitch more severely. The image of Mr. Henderson, Watering his roses flickered and was replaced by a view of the vast, empty Alaskan tundra. The two realities were swapping back and forth now, like a faulty projector switching between slides. The sound of the mail truck was interwoven with the high, thin scream of the wind over a mountain pass. My house was no longer in Oregon. It was nowhere. It was a pocket of space-time being actively rewritten. Then the final phase began. Ethan dropped the photograph and stood up straight. The clicking static started again, emanating from him, filling the room. But this time, it was different. It was softer, more insidious. It was the sound of a hard drive beginning to defragment. "The compilation is initiating," he announced, his voice now a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my chest. I felt a strange, tingling sensation at the base of my skull. It wasn't painful. It was a feeling of access. I could feel my own memories being pulled, not from my mind, but from the very fabric of my being. It was a gentle, terrifying violation. I saw flashes of my life, not as I remembered them, but as objective events, stripped of all emotion. My first kiss, a clumsy, nervous collision of teeth, was reduced to a set of coordinates and tactile pressure readings. The grief I felt at my grandmother's funeral was a quantifiable spike in cortisol and a specific pattern of neural activity. My humanity was being translated into code. I screamed and scrambled backwards, trying to break the connection, trying to anchor myself in the physical world. I grabbed the heavy wooden armchair and hurled it at him with all my strength. It flew through the air, and just before impact, it de-resolved. It dissolved into a cloud of shimmering pixels and vanished, just as his arm had done on the mountain. There was nothing physical to fight. The static grew louder. The house around me began to lose its form entirely. The walls became transparent, showing the swirling, chaotic data storm of the anomaly. I was no longer in a room. I was inside the machine, inside the mind of the entities. I saw information as a physical landscape, vast libraries of archived lives stretching into infinity, each one a silent, screaming testament to this cold, cosmic process. I saw Ethan, not the replica in front of me, but the real Ethan, the original file. He was a glowing spectral thread woven into the fabric of this place. His consciousness, a single captive note in an infinite silent song. He wasn't dead, he was stored. As my own world dissolved, I fought back with the only weapon I had left. I focused all my will, all my being, on a single chaotic, illogical, purely human memory. The memory of laughing with Ethan in the front seat of his Bronco, the windows down, a terrible rock song blasting on the radio, driving towards the mountain, towards our doom, utterly and beautifully unaware. I held on to the feeling of the wind, the sound of his terrible singing, the warmth of the sun, the sheer stupid joy of being young and alive with my best friend. I threw the memory at him, a messy, emotional, unquantifiable ball of pure life. The Ethan replica flinched for a single breathtaking instant. The static faltered. The placid, empty expression on his face was replaced by a look of profound confusion. A flicker of the real Ethan, the archived Ethan, surfaced. His mouth opened, and he spoke a single word, not in the flat tone of the entity, but in his own voice, the voice I hadn't heard in 20 years, filled with a ghost of his old warmth. Liam. It was a question, an echo of a soul trapped in the machine. Then the moment passed. The static surged, louder than ever. The placid mask slammed back into place. The entity reasserted control. The brief flicker of my friend was gone, extinguished by the cold, overwhelming logic of the system. My final act of defiance had been nothing more than a momentary system error, a bug that was instantly patched. My strength left me. I collapsed onto the floor, which was no longer a floor but a shifting sea of light and information. The tingling in my skull became a powerful, pulling sensation. My vision dissolved into a torrent of raw data. The last thing I saw was my own hands. my 42-year-old hands, becoming transparent, their edges blurring, the skin and bone de-resolving into the light. I wasn't dying. I was being copied. I was being archived. And as the last vestiges of my consciousness were unspooled and drawn into the silent, infinite library of the mountain, I understood the final terrible truth. The entities didn't just take you, they left a copy behind. A perfect hollow echo to walk the world, to observe, to mimic, to gather more data, and, when the time was right, to call the next subject home. My quiet suburban street wasn't just being glitched, it was being prepared. It was the next collection point. I wasn't the end of the story, I was just the bridge.